All right, if you have one of those electronic devices, before I introduced our speaker today, make sure you turn those off or put those on mute, because you are in for a phenomenal lecture on perhaps a moment of the Gettysburg battle that has long been lost to history. So I want to introduce you today to Laura Elliot. Laura is a historian and author whose primary research interests is McLaws and Kershaw's brigades, or McLaws Division, Kershaw's Brigade of Longstreet's Corps. She has a family connection that sparked her initial interest in the 16th Georgia of Wofford's Brigade, and her research has gradually expanded to include all 4 brigades of that understudied division. Completely agree with that, Laura. Laura has contributed important research to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, the Library of Congress, Manassas National Battlefield Park, the South Carolina Library, the South Carolina Federation of Museums, and other institutions. Her articles have been published in Gettysburg Magazine, Military Images, and other Civil War journals. She lives near Gadsden, Alabama. Please welcome Laura Elliot.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a fantastic introduction. I appreciate you having me here today, and I appreciate you making sure that the article was published in Gettysburg Magazine. Many thanks, of course, to Gettysburg National Military Park Chief of Interpretation and Education, Christopher Gwynn, who made the invitation, and also the National Park Service for the opportunity to be here and share this research with you today. A few weeks ago, you guys might have been here. My friend, Gettysburg National Military Park Ranger, Matt Atkinson, stood at this podium, and in front of a packed house. It was full. All the seats were full. And Matt revealed Lee's mysterious general, Ambrose Powell Hill. As we've come to expect, Matt did a fantastic job, an outstanding lecture, very well done. During the program, Matt used an upside-down pyramid, something like this, to illustrate the organization of the Army. It's a particularly effective graphic, so I decided to borrow it. Hopefully Matt won't mind. Generally, most scholarship focuses on the top of the pyramid, the wide part, the corps, brigades, and regiments, where more sources are more readily available. But down on the narrow end of the pyramid, walking in the footsteps of a specific company is not nearly as common, which is what we'll be doing today. Amid the clamor of battle, the roar of cannon, and the smoke, a benchmark moment of the Battle of Gettysburg that has been overlooked by historians until now, a massive multi-casualty artillery impact more destructive than any previously documented at the Battle of Gettysburg. Let's explore how this event remained in the shadows for so long. I wrote an article about it that was published in Gettysburg Magazine, issue number 71, thanks to Dan, this past summer. Most of you probably subscribe, and I hope you've already read it. If you haven't, be sure to pick up a copy. Today, I'll provide an overview and share some of what's not included in the article. We'll begin with a landmark that you'll probably recognize, the James Warfield House on the battlefield, recently restored by the National Park Service. Located here on Warfield Ridge, down on the south end of the battlefield, west of the Peach Orchard and along the Millerstown Road. The Warfield family was part of the free black community around Gettysburg. James Warfield was a highly regarded blacksmith and had just purchased the property, 13-acre property, about a year earlier. The Warfields weren't home on July 2nd, 1863, to witness the battle or the burials. When they returned home, they discovered dead Confederates buried in the garden. Simon G. Elliot noted the graves on his map of temporary battlefield burials. He drew hash marks indicating 13 graves in the front yard of the Warfield house and other graves scattered about the property for a total of 17. Elliot labeled the 13 depressions at the Warfield house as graves of the 9th, 13th, and 16th Mississippi. But men of the 13th Mississippi, Barksdale's brigade, may well have been buried there. But at least some of the graves at the Warfield house were mislabeled. The 9th Mississippi was not even at Gettysburg. Pretty sure they weren't there. And the 16th Mississippi of Posey's brigade was positioned nearly a mile away. 9 years after Elliot drew the map, 6 sets of remains recorded as unknown and unidentified dead were disinterred from temporary graves at James Warfield's house, sent south, and reinterred at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond in 1873. In 1874, 4 more unidentified graves were removed from Warfield's property, most likely these 4. There's no record the other 7 graves on the Warfield property were ever removed. No one knew the names of the men who rested in the graves at the Warfield house. No one knew others were left behind. About 10 years ago, I stumbled on a transcript of a speech given by this man, Lafayette McLaws, before the Georgia Historical Society at Savannah. It was printed in the newspaper the next day, and a similar version appeared in the Southern Historical Society papers in 1879. One company, numbering 37, had, by the bursting of a shell in its front as it went into the charge, lost 30 men, 6 killed, leaving but 7 unhurt. I remember reading that and thinking, wow, that's a lot of casualties from a single shell. McLaws didn't say which regiment or even which brigade those men belonged to. And I wanted to know not just what brigade or regiment they were in, but I wanted to know who they were. What were their names? Where were they from? And where the incident occurred. But with those 4 brigades in McLaws' division, it was like searching for a needle in a haystack, which I guess is why nobody had ever found it before. Just after the Battle of Gettysburg, a member of Wofford's brigade told the tragic tale of a catastrophic artillery impact. Dated July 25th and published in the Richmond Enquirer August 7th, 1863. A single shell which exploding in the ranks of the 16th Georgia Regiment killed 8 and wounded 21. 15 years later, Lafayette McLaws recounted those staggering losses in that speech, that 1878 speech that I told you about. For the next 145 years, the savage shell went generally overlooked and forgotten. Nobody tried to pinpoint the catastrophe or identify the casualties until now. Ill-fated Masons from Jackson County, Georgia, perhaps the unluckiest company in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The Center Hill Guards were practically destroyed at Gettysburg. The little company of Masons was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the tragedy was not confined to the battlefield. 600 miles away, back in Jackson County, the impact was personal. In the rural, close-knit community, everyone knew someone whose name was on the casualty list, or they were related to them. Before the war, this man, Abner Monroe Reynolds, was master of the local Masonic Lodge and the sheriff of Jackson County. On June 24, 1861, the Rockwell Masonic Lodge held its regular monthly meeting, and at that meeting, members expressed their intent to enlist in the Confederate Army, and each man enrolled his name right there. They chose the name Center Hill Guards. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Dilmas Lyle and the ladies of Center Hill presented a flag to the company. Ensign Owen T. David received the banner, stating, "We go expecting nothing but hardships and privations." It seems the young lieutenant had an ominous premonition of things to come. 74 eager volunteers boarded the train at Athens, bound for Richmond. By July 27th, they had established a campsite at the reservoir near Hollywood Cemetery. 34 new recruits joined them in August, bringing their number to 108. The men elected Abner Reynolds their captain, and the Center Hill Guards officially became Company B of the 16th Georgia Infantry. Like Captain Reynolds, most of the members of the company were Masons, or the sons of Masons. These were no holiday soldiers. By the time they marched north to Gettysburg and waded the Potomac for the second time, the men had already experienced significant combat. The 16th Georgia was baptized by fire in April of 1862 when they repulsed a riparian assault at Dam No. 1 on the Warwick River near Yorktown. At Malvern Hill, they calmly loaded and capped their rifles as shells tore great gaps in their ranks. They were overrun and all but surrounded at Crampton's Gap, steadied their Enfield rifles on the stone wall at Fredericksburg, and compelled the surrender of the 27th Connecticut at Chancellorsville. 92 of their original 108 Center Hill Guards had already been lost prior to the Gettysburg campaign. Some were permanent losses, dead and discharged. Others were temporary losses, wounded and captured. Of the permanent losses, 12 had been dismissed for disability, unfit for service, under or over age. At least 20 had died of disease in camps and in hospitals. And those deaths from disease included 26-year-old Lieutenant Owen David. You'll recall the ensign who accepted the flag from the ladies. He died at Richmond in October of 1861. And another member of the company, 48-year-old Lieutenant Henry Hoosh, volunteered at the beginning despite being exempted for over age. He died of disease also in July of 1862. Before they marched to Pennsylvania, Company B had accumulated 60 battlefield casualties at Malvern Hill, Crampton's Gap, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. 13 dead, 27 wounded, and 20 captured, leaving just 16 of 108 who had not yet become casualties. A handful of new recruits mustered in. Most of the prisoners were exchanged, and as the wounded recovered, they rejoined the ranks, but the dead were not coming back. The most universally lamented loss in the company was that of the founding captain, Abner Reynolds. The master mason, who had organized the Center Hill Guards and enrolled their names at the lodge, was not with them at Gettysburg. He had been killed September 14, 1862, at Crampton's Gap. John Mormon Venable succeeded Reynolds as captain and commanded the diminished company at Gettysburg. 32-year-old Hiram James Cox had been promoted to lieutenant. Along with Reynolds and Venable, he was one of the original Masons to enlist in the company in July of 1861. Cox had been wounded at Fredericksburg. A piece of shrapnel slammed into his heel. He made the march to Pennsylvania anyway, likely still favoring the other foot. Cox was not the only member of the Center Hill Guards who would be wounded again at the Battle of Gettysburg. The little company of Masons was part of the 16th Georgia Infantry Regiment, commanded at Gettysburg by 51-year-old West Point-educated Colonel Good Bryan, appointed lieutenant colonel in May of 1861. He had been a familiar constant throughout the commencement throughout the war. The 16th Georgia was originally organized by Howell Cobb, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, ex-governor of Georgia, and president of the Confederate Congress. He was the original colonel. When Howell Cobb was promoted to brigade command, Good Bryan was elevated to colonel and had commanded the regiment ever since. In the larger organization, the 16th Georgia was part of the brigade commanded by William Tatum Wofford. Wofford had been colonel of the 18th Georgia, brigaded with Hood's Texans. Earlier in the war, Wofford and the 18th Georgia earned a solid reputation at Antietam, in the cornfield at Antietam, and also at 2nd Manassas. The 16th Georgia had been serving in Cobb's brigade with Cobb's Legion and the 24th Georgia since April of 1862. A reorganization in November resulted in the addition of Phillips Legion and the 18th Georgia. Of course, in December of 1862, you probably all know Thomas Reed Roots Cobb was mortally wounded at Fredericksburg. Wofford at that time was elevated to brigade command. Almost immediately, he organized a battalion of sharpshooters from men in the regiments of his brigade. It's kind of interesting that on the battlefield you won't see the 3rd Battalion sharpshooters listed on the tablet, but they were definitely here participating in the Battle of Gettysburg. Wofford's official debut as brigadier was at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. His performance earned him the admiration of peers, subordinates, and superiors. Casualties in Wofford's brigade at Chancellorsville were heavy. By 2 months later, when they marched to Gettysburg, half his usual regimental commanders were absent. Only one colonel, Good Bryan, was here, with his 16th Georgia. A slight wound he received at Chancellorsville had healed, and he made the march to Pennsylvania despite suffering from gout, a condition that plagued him throughout the war. 2 regiments, the 18th Georgia and the 3rd Battalion Sharpshooters, were commanded by experienced lieutenant colonels, but command of Cobb's and Phillips' legions devolved to majors. Worse still, the 24th Georgia was commanded by a captain who had never led a regiment, let alone in battle. Lack of experienced leadership contributed to the catastrophe that occurred here at Gettysburg. To the Georgians of Wofford's brigade, the endless wait on July 2nd must have seemed like an eternity. Partially sheltered by a skirt of woods, the men anxiously anticipated the order to advance. A Confederate artillery battery positioned nearby drew enemy fire. Soon enough, skilled Union artillerists found the precise range. Officers directed the men to lie down to escape as much as possible the torrential rain of shot and shell. Streaking shells and showering shrapnel were not new to the war-hardened veterans of the 16th Georgia, but they would prove disastrous at Gettysburg. The diminished Company B, Center Hill Guards, fell into line at the edge of the woods to await the order to advance. Acting as color company for the 16th Georgia that day, they were positioned near the center of the regiment. Located here along Warfield Ridge, near the Warfield house I showed you earlier, the map, just to kind of help you get your bearings, the position of Wofford's brigade on July 2nd, located down on the south end of the battlefield. And here's that section enlarged so you can see a little bit better. Edward Porter Alexander's Confederate artillery lined up there along Warfield Ridge. Wofford's brigade and Barksdale's Mississippians lined up there at the edge of the woods waiting. And the Warfield house there, Sherfy Farm and the Peach Orchard to the east. This image by my friend Phil Spaggy illustrates the proximity. Taylor's battery of Confederate artillery there on the ridge, the Warfield house just ahead, and the Klingel Farm in the distance, where Seeley's Battery K of the 4th U.S. Artillery was positioned. You can also see the corner of the Sherfy house ahead there on the right. From the woods, Wofford's brigade was headed east. The 16th Georgia was at the center of the regiment, at the center of the brigade. Cobb's Legion on their left. The 24th Georgia adopted its customary position to the right of the 16th. Phillips' Legion on the extreme left and the 18th Georgia on the far right. The 3rd Battalion sharpshooters were deployed in front as skirmishers. It was the same alignment Wofford had used at Chancellorsville, and it would be his go-to configuration for the rest of the war. Eventually, Corps Commander James Longstreet, and Division Commander Lafayette McLaws rode up on horseback. The two men spoke briefly with Wofford. Wofford saluted, and galloped to the front of his brigade. "Boys, our time has come. Today you will make all of Georgia proud," his men responded with a wild cheer, quieted only by Wofford's upraised hand. "Remember, guide to the center on the colors and fight like hell." Another yell burst forward, and Wofford gave the order, "Right shoulder shift, forward, quick time, march. Only a handful of Center Hill Guards would escape unscathed. The Confederate batteries of interest here, Parker, Taylor, Moody, and Rhett. Rhett's battery was commanded by Gilbert that day. They were directly in the path of Barksdale and Wofford's brigades. By the time Wofford finally received the order to advance, Barksdale's brigade had already passed through the batteries with only minor difficulty. Barksdale had progressed well into the fight and was far ahead of Wofford. Again, those Confederate batteries of interest, Parker, Taylor, and Moody, and Gilbert, and the alignment of Wofford's brigade was right to left, 8th, 24th, 16th Georgia, Cobb's, and Phillips Legion, with the sharpshooters out front. Up to now, the maps I've been showing you kind of make it look like there weren't any Union troops on the field, and nothing could be further from the truth. There were still plenty, including this battery of 6 Napoleons. Battery K of the 4th U.S. Artillery, commanded by Lieutenant Francis W. Seeley. On the Confederate side of the field, we've already seen Captain Osmond B. Taylor's battery of 4 Napoleons was just south of the Millerstown Road and about 90 yards behind the Warfield house. Taylor reported his battery received heavy fire from Union artillery positioned in his front. One of his best gunners was killed and 5 others wounded, including at least one by spherical case shot. Here's that view again that Taylor would have had from his battery's position. A little further south, Parker's battery was to Taylor's right. As Wofford got underway, the 18th Georgia passed through Parker's battery without mishap. Mounted on his bay mare, Wofford himself was riding over on the extreme right with the 18th Georgia. Passage of the 18th through Parker's battery is supported by the position of Parker's battery on the field, along with the alignment of the regiments in the brigade, and a member of the battery confirms. But now comes the brave infantry, Wofford of Georgia, his hat off and his bald head shining in the sun. Hurrah for you of the bald head! Hurrah for you of the bald head was repeated by the cannoneers. Captain James Law Lemon also confirms that Wofford passed through Parker's battery with his regiment, the 18th Georgia. General Wofford had ridden over to the right of our lines near his beloved old 18th Georgia. We double-quicked through our guns, which ceased their fire to allow our passage, and when doing so, the gunners removed their hats and cheered us gaily. We, our spirits up, cheered them in return. The cheering would not last long. At the same time, the 18th Georgia passed through Parker's battery. The 24th Georgia on their left should have passed through Taylor's battery like this, but that's not what happened. Lafayette McLaws acknowledged that something happened as the regiments of Wofford's brigade passed through the batteries, but he didn't say which regiment had an issue. Barksdale and Wofford had been mixed up with the batteries and were temporarily delayed in extricating themselves therefrom. So much was it the case with one of Wofford's regiments that it did not get out to join the brigade until it had gone about 100 yards. Once again, our informant, Captain James Law Lemon, sets the record straight. Our regiment, remember he was part of the 18th Georgia, our regiment had passed through the guns about 100 yards or so. When looking back, I noticed that the 24th Georgia had become unaccountably delayed by the guns. Their formation had been disrupted, and their officers were endeavoring to reform them. The August 7th, 1863 Richmond Enquirer article that I showed you at the beginning also identifies the 24th Georgia as a regiment that became entangled. I began to wonder if this entanglement at the batteries might have something to do with the savage artillery impact, but how did it happen? At Gettysburg, Peter A.S. McGlashan was serving as major of the 50th Georgia, Sims Brigade. In 1898, he addressed Confederate veterans at Savannah, 20 years after McLaws had given that speech, and 35 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. McGlashan says a shell exploded in front of the center of the 16th Georgia, killing and wounding 29 men out of 33 of the color company. Company B, the Center Hill Guards, is the only company of the 16th Georgia that reported a high enough casualty count to be the unfortunate recipients of the shell. So the diminished band of Masons was acting as color company that day at Gettysburg. The color company, I learned, is not the same as the color guard. The color guard would have been at the center of the regiment, and the color company was positioned to the immediate right of the color guard, still near the center of the regiment. So back to that 24th Georgia mix-up in Taylor's Battery, this contributory incident. What should have been a simple correction turned into a disaster. The 24th Georgia was being led by Captain Joseph Newton Chandler of Company A. He was a hotel manager and assessor of estray mules with no formal military training. The innkeeper turned captain was commanding the regiment for the first time in battle that day. Chandler's lack of experience likely contributed to the mishap and, of course, prevented him from being able to correct it quickly. From his position on the right, remember Wofford was riding on the extreme right with his the regiment that he had formerly been colonel of, the 18th Georgia. And so he observed this gap between his 18th Georgia on the right and the 16th Georgia in the center, a big gap. About the same time, Colonel Good Bryan detected the breach on his right. Bryan, commanding the 16th Georgia, immediately ordered his regiment to halt and lie down. Enraged, Wofford galloped back to the 24th Georgia, swearing and shouting. Likely still suffering to some extent from gout, Bryan limped back 100 yards to help rectify the situation. It took 2 experienced officers to extricate the 24th Georgia from Taylor's Battery and get them reformed. The Center Hill Guards, Company B of the 16th Georgia Infantry, would bear the consequences. Private Stephen Charles O'Kelly was an eyewitness. Had he not written about the incident post-war, I don't think there would be any way to actually understand what happened there. O'Kelly was lying in his position with Company A along the 16th Georgia's line of battle. Company B was near the center. Remember, they were acting as color company that day, so they had been moved from their normal position to near the center, while Company A was most likely on the far right. Even if Company A was lined up on the left, the far left, the entire regimental front of the 16th Georgia was just over 100 yards. So O'Kelly was not more than 60 yards away, no matter which end of the line his company was on. O'Kelly tells us the 24th Georgia on our right wavered and scattered. Colonel Bryan ordered us to lie down, and he went amongst the 24th. While we were halted, every member of Company B present was said to have been killed or wounded except 2. The number, of course, should have been all but 4 or 29 of 33. Either way, as color company that day, the little band of Masons had emerged from the tree line at the batteries, advanced 100 yards, and been ordered to halt and lie down. They were flat on the ground in the front yard of James Warfield's house. The regiment was still tightly grouped, and their prone bodies presented a carpet of flesh. An artillery round, almost certainly 12-pounder spherical case shot, exploded midair and in front of the line of prone men. The shell exploded optimally. Its velocity continued forward, blasting some 80 lead balls and fragments of iron case directly into Company B's position. 8 killed, 7 mortally wounded, and 14 wounded, for a total of 29 casualties. Others recalled the total number as 30. Either way, the casualty count exceeds any other individual artillery impact documented at the Battle of Gettysburg, and all 29 were members of one unfortunate company. Nearly every man in the Center Hill Guards was impacted, only possible, of course, because it was so early in the advance. They were still tightly grouped, in a line of battle too deep, and lying down. There was really nowhere for a ball or piece of the case to land that wasn't a body part. When Colonel Bryan returned, he discovered at least 29 casualties among the Center Hill Guards. 8 were already dead. Our informant, Stephen Charles O'Kelly of Company D, recalled, "I saw one old fellow, I have forgotten his name, going round and round, one half his skull was knocked off. He walked about until he soon fell and died there." The old fellow, whose name O'Kelly couldn't recall, is easily identified. At 53 years old, Thomas Jefferson Kidd was the oldest victim of the explosion. He left his first wife, his second wife, Millie Ann Kidd, a widow with several minor children. Doc Singleton Kerbo, pictured here, enlisted in July of 1861. He was one of 11 original members of the Center Hill Guards who became casualties at Gettysburg. He left Frances, Virginia, a widow with 5 young children. Joseph Solomon, the youngest, was only 4 months old. Doc had never seen him. The youngest victim of the shell was also an immediate fatality. 16-year-old John H. Reynolds had served just 5 months and 15 days before he was killed. His father, James M. Reynolds, filed a claim for his back pay in February of 1864. The youngster had been paid through April 1863. After stoppages for clothing, there was nothing due his family back in Jackson County. There were 8 Center Hill Guards killed immediately or who died directly from the impact of the shell. We talked about these 3. But there was also 23-year-old Thomas J. Bradley. He was an immediate fatality. He left a widow and 3 small children. Here's a picture of his brother, Lieutenant Francis Marion Bradley. Francis had served in the same company, the Center Hill Guards, and died of camp fever in January near Fredericksburg, January 1863. The other 4 members killed immediately. 29-year-old Charles L. Davis was one of 9 casualties in the Center Hill Guards at Gettysburg who had been wounded before. A lot of them had been wounded before at other places. Davis had been wounded just weeks before at Chancellorsville in the right knee, but he marched to Pennsylvania anyway and was killed immediately by the shell, leaving a widow and 3 small children. His brother served in Company F of the 16th Georgia, the same regiment. He was captured at Gettysburg and died of chronic dysentery in May of 1865 at Point Lookout. 22-year-old Corporal David Sanford Harvell was one of the 11 casualties who had enlisted at the beginning. He was an unmarried farm laborer and lived next door to Arthur Wall, who was wounded by the same shell. You know, the companies were made up of men from the same community, so you often had neighbors, brothers, relatives in the same company. So Arthur Wall, his neighbor, was wounded by the same shell. Harvell had just returned to duty in June after a nasty ulcerated leg wound, but he marched to Gettysburg anyway and was killed by the shell. 23-year-old Samuel M. Moore, here on the screen, was also one of the original 11 enlistees who were casualties at Gettysburg. His older brother Alfred was wounded by the same shell. Their widowed mother, Mary, filed for Sam's back pay in September of 1863. 26-year-old William Jasper Williams, he's here on the screen, the very last one that I found in all this research to find out about these men. Jasper was the last one that I was able to find in census record, or really any kind of records. His name is William Jasper, but he was recorded on the casualty report as J.W. Williams. It took a while to track him down. Collateral descendants confirm that he went by Jasper and that he was killed at Gettysburg. He enlisted July of 1862 and served in the company less than a year before he was killed. The 8 killed were buried near where they fell, there near the Warfield house. Almost certainly, 8 of those 13 graves on Elliot's map belong to members of Company B of the 16th Georgia Infantry, Center Hill Guards killed by the catastrophic explosion right there in the yard. 21 wounded Center Hill Guards survived the blast, at least temporarily. It was over a mile back across Warfield Ridge, as the crow flies, to get to John Cunningham's farm, which is where Wofford's Brigade Hospital was. You had to cross through the Marsh Creek Ford to get there from Crawford's farm, which some of you may be familiar with. But when you cross from Crawford's through the Ford, you come out in front of the Cunningham farm. Dr. Irwin J. Eldridge, Wofford's brigade surgeon, rode to the door late on the afternoon of July 2nd and informed Mr. Cunningham, John Cunningham, that his buildings would be required for hospital use for the wounded of Wofford's brigade. The big bank barn was almost empty in July, so the barn was chosen rather than the house. Cunningham's daughter recalled, by nightfall, the stretcher bearers began to arrive with their mangled burdens. All night long, the wounded were carried in on stretchers. Dr. Eldridge, the regimental surgeons and medical staff had their hands full. Wofford's wounded, 220 soldiers of the 16th, 18th, 24th Georgia, Cobb's, and Phillips Legions, and the 3rd Battalion Sharpshooters, with every injury imaginable, including 21 Center Hill Guards, some with gruesome wounds from the exploding shell. Arms, legs, feet, and fingers demanded amputation if the patients were to survive, and the surgeries needed to be performed as quickly as possible. 11 extremities, 2 arms, 2 legs, and 7 fingers were disarticulated from members of Company B of the 16th Georgia. Others likely endured surgeries that went unrecorded. The next morning, John Cunningham awoke to what must have been a grisly scene. Maimed and suffering men covered every nook and cranny of the barn, barnyard, and orchard. The slightly wounded were up and about, but at least 7 had died overnight. Interjecting real quickly, in the center of the room right here, you'll see Mr. Lechak. Will you raise your hand? Phil Lechak here. Mr. Lechak arranged just yesterday, for the first time ever, I was able to actually go on to the Cunningham farm, and we actually went into the barn and were able to observe the situation there. They removed a smaller door from a large door in the barn to use as an operating table, and we actually saw that door is still there. Of course, it may not be the same boards, may not be the same exact lumber that was there at the time, but they still have the smaller door within the door. Pretty interesting. So poor Mr. Cunningham woke up to see the situation there at his farm. John Cunningham requested that the dead be buried in the orchard. By the time it was over, 17 graves belonging to men of Wofford's Brigade were dug in 2 long rows among the fruit trees. 7 of those 17 graves were filled by Center Hill Guards, all mortally wounded by the artillery impact. 3 died before the morning of July 3rd. All 3 had enlisted as original members of the company and served side by side for nearly 2 years. James Rufus Cosby had just recovered from a hip wound at Chancellorsville, but he marched to Pennsylvania and died July 2nd. He left a widow and 2 small children. Samuel, the youngest, was 3. 26-year-old John M. Roberts has no carded records. Had his name not been published on the original muster roll and included on the casualty list, it would be impossible to know that he was killed at Gettysburg, mortally wounded at Gettysburg. At 41 years old, Allen D. Hoopaw was the oldest temporary survivor. Back in Jackson County, Hoopaw left a widow and 3 small children. 3 more Center Hill Guards died on July 5th and 6th. and were also buried at the Cunningham Orchard. 19-year-old James W. Poole was seriously wounded in the leg, and his arm was amputated. Back in Georgia, his widowed mother, Priscilla, filed for his back pay. There's no record that she was ever compensated. 19-year-old Robert Randolph and 22-year-old Washington Randolph were first cousins. Their fathers were brothers, and both of their mothers were widowed. Both of their fathers were dead, and their mothers were widows. Robert died July 5th. Wash passed the next day. Washington's mother filed for his back pay and received $57. Robert's family never knew what happened to him. Collateral descendants were stunned to finally learn his fate. When I corresponded to the family genealogist on March 22nd, 2023, imagine never knowing. The 27th mortally wounded, the 7th mortally wounded member of the Center Hill Guards lingered for a month. 22-year-old Corporal Allen T. Justice. Justice was the younger brother of Captain Venable's wife, so Captain Venable's brother-in-law. It must have been difficult for Captain Venable to write mortally wounded on the casualty report next to the name of his own brother-in-law. On the affidavit filed to obtain his back pay, Justice's mother stated that he died August 5th, 1863. He was the last of 17 Georgians buried in Cunningham's Orchard. Wofford's brigade departed Cunningham's farm on the night of July 4th. The captain of the Center Hill Guards, John Venable, was among those who escaped unscathed or with only minor injuries, very minor. On July 9th, the retreating Confederates stopped at Williamsport, Maryland, and Captain Venable sent that casualty report back to the local newspaper detailing the casualties in his company. Please publish the above list, and you will oblige many anxious friends. Indeed. It's amazing anyone survived, but 5 wounded Center Hill Guards were recovered enough to join the retreat. All 5 of them survived their wounds and the war. 28-year-old Alfred Asbury Moore lost 3 fingers, but survived the war and eventually became a preacher. His 23-year-old brother, Samuel, was dead, killed by the same shell that took away Alfred's fingers. 32-year-old Lieutenant Hiram James Cox, wounded slightly in the breast, returned to active service. He was wounded again, that would have been his 3rd time, and captured at Guard Hill, but survived the war. He was buried with Masonic honors in 1909. Cox's cousin, David Isaac Hardigree, was wounded by the same shell. He also recovered and returned to active service with his regiment. In April 1865, Hardigree was one of only 4 Center Hill Guards who surrendered at Appomattox. William Elbert Hill, wounded in the neck or shoulder, returned to active service and was captured at Cold Harbor. He survived the war and remained active in the Masonic Lodge his entire life. John Chapel Strange had just recovered from a severe neck wound at Chancellorsville, and he was wounded again at Gettysburg, severely in the foot. He was captured with Hill at Cold Harbor, but survived imprisonment and the war. 50 of Wofford's wounded were unable to join the retreat. They were left behind at Cunningham's under the care of 24-year-old Acting Assistant Surgeon David H. Ramseur. Ramseur was a real doctor. He had just received his MD in 1861, a young doctor with an actual MD. 6 Center Hill Guards, 2 seriously wounded to travel, were among those left behind for Dr. Ramseur to care for. They were captured in the hospital at Cunningham's. 25-year-old Milton Thomas Adams must have been too seriously wounded to travel. His injuries are not specified, but by July 25th, he had been transferred to DeCamp General Hospital, David's Island, New York Harbor, paroled and quickly exchanged. He rejoined the company and was wounded and captured again. in August of 1864 at Guard Hill, Virginia, imprisoned at Elmira, and released in June of 1865. 21-year-old Reddick Howell Betts was wounded severely in the thigh, left behind and captured, transferred to Union hospitals, paroled in exchange, most of them very quickly, by the end of August. In May of 1864, Reddick Howell Betts was on the wrong end of another shell at Spotsylvania, and he beat the odds again. He returned to service again and was one of 4 remaining Center Hill Guards to surrender at Appomattox. Reddick and his wife Nancy had 9 children, only 5 are pictured here. Others severely wounded were captured at Cunningham's, transferred to Union hospitals, paroled, and quickly exchanged by the end of August. William Robert Alexander Boyd, 22, Arthur Wall, we mentioned him earlier, they were both wounded severely in the thigh. John Henry Deverell, age 20, was also wounded severely in the thigh, and he lost 4 fingers on his right hand. Wall was captured again at Cold Harbor, imprisoned at Point Lookout, where he died August 25th, 1864. Boyd returned to the regiment, was captured again in 1865, but eventually made it back to Georgia. In 1871, he became a master mason. John Henry Deverell was transferred to detached service due to his wound. He was the son of Irish immigrant parents and the last survivor of the ruthless shell. He died April 14th, 1923, at 79 years of age, still missing all the fingers on his right hand. 17-year-old Marcus A. Ellison refused to die. On Captain Venable's July 9th casualty list, Ellison was recorded as mortally wounded. Surgeons amputated his right leg, and a grisly head wound carried away his right eye. It's easy to see how Captain Venable observed the teen and predicted he would not survive. But Ellison did not know that he had been killed. He was captured at Cunningham's, transferred to Union hospitals, underwent more surgery, endured lengthy hospitalizations, and eventually made it back to Georgia. Mark Ellison's physical injuries healed, but the emotional wounds never did. By 1871, the 25-year-old, one-legged, one-eyed veteran had killed 2 men. He was imprisoned for manslaughter, and in 1875, stabbed a guard. He attempted suicide by cutting his own throat with a razor, but was unsuccessful. 3 years later, Ellison successfully ended his own life by cutting his own throat for the second time with a razor. Perhaps Captain Venable was right when he wrote "mortally wounded" next to Ellison's name. These were no paper-collared soldiers. These were the men from Rockwell, Jug Tavern, Mulberry, and Center Hill, Jackson County, Georgia, who followed Lee and Longstreet, tramped through the Valley of Virginia, and saw the battle flags tattered and torn, who mixed their voices with the roar and clamor of the battle. And many of them never came home. I hope some of you this afternoon, maybe you'll stop by the Warfield house, walk out to the front yard, beyond that tree there in the yard, and take a moment to reflect on the Center Hill Guards, Company B of the 16th Georgia Infantry, the unfortunate victims of the most destructive artillery impact of the Battle of Gettysburg. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them now.